The Royal Flying Corps and the Royal Air Force that it later helped form has many fine traditions,
Anybody can do that.
and the coining of nicknames is one of its best. Those who walk the messes of the land branded forever with a nom de guerre normally acquire the new moniker through amusing traits or circumstances. The same could be said for Battle Britain pilot Grumpy George Unwin. The then 19 Squadron Flight Sergeant was introduced to the world as Grumpy in a wartime book, written under an alias to protect the identity of his fellow squadron mate. It would take 50 years for Unwin to be able to refute the claims made in the book Spitfire, and tell his version of why a 27-year-old fighter pilot was just so very grumpy. Born near Doncaster, South Yorkshire in 1913, George was loath to follow his coal miner father into the pits. With little other prospects in the area, George was helped by a schoolmaster to apply for a position as an RAF apprentice. This 2-year administrative course between 1929 and 1931 enabled him to apply for pilot training in 1935. Having gained his wings, this coal miner's son would become a sergeant pilot and future member of the Few. He arrived at 19 Squadron in August 1936, joining a flight led by Flight Lieutenant Harry Broadhurst, and became a long-serving member of that elite squadron. Pre-war, it was 19 Squadron that won all the competitions the RAF cared to organise, be it navigation, shooting or tactical skills. They also traditionally took on whichever was the latest fighter to be introduced to fighter command, from the Bristol Bulldog to the Gloucester Gauntlets, with the exception of the Hurricane that was first given to Treble 1 Squadron. No doubt when the Spitfire arrived at Duxford in 1938, no one at 19 Squadron then cared about having had their drone beaten up by a squadron of 12 gleeful treblers, showing off the then best fighter in the RAF. Soon, 12 Spitfires repaid the compliment over Northolt. Flight Sergeant Unwin flew with the squadron right through the Phoney War and was present at Hornchurch when the squadron arrived there on the evening of the 25th of May 1940. The next day would be the squadron's first real taste of action, and also the day Brian Lane claimed George became grumpy.
Smoking, talking. 14 pilots assembled on the tarmac, wondering who would be the unlucky 2 who would have to stay behind. We had brought 12 aircraft with us, and 2 extra pilots had come down by road the previous night. The section leaders alone looked quite happy, for they knew they were definite starters. For fairness, we drew names out of a hat, and face after face lighted up as its owner's name was called. In my flight, the unlucky one was Flight Sergeant U, and he stood looking at me with a hurt expression on his face, for all the world like a dog who had been told he can't come for a walk. I went over to try and console him, but he just shook his head sadly and said, "Well, I'm damned, sir." I couldn't help it. I burst out laughing while the other pilots shot humorous remarks at him. "Go on, Grumpy. You'll live to fight another day. Don't get too drunk while we're away." And that was why, from that time on, one flight sergeant was called Grumpy.
Flight Sergeant Unwin needn't have worried. The next day he was in action himself and claimed an HS-126 destroyed with Flying Officer Brinston. Unwin would go on to fly operations with 19 Squadron throughout the Battle of Britain before being posted to No. 2 Central Flying School for a rest at the end of 1940. He was commissioned the next year and served in training command until 1943. Grumpy was back on operations with 613 Squadron in 1944 flying Mosquito fighter bombers, and in 1945 was teaching gunnery to new pilots at RAF Catfuss. Grumpy stayed in the RAF until 1961 and even flew Bristol Brigands during the Malayan emergency in 1952. It wasn't until the early 1990s that Wing Commander Unwin finally explained how he had really gained the name Grumpy, and it had everything to do with a young man he had met in 1931, a man who had recently lost both legs in an ill-advised low roll in a Bristol Bulldog. As is often the case with men we now associate most strongly with the Battle of Britain, George Unwin disappeared from the public eye almost the minute that Brian Lane's book was published in 1942. George was not one for tooting his own trumpet, nor did he frequent reunions or gatherings held for RAF servicemen from the war. This all changed when a retired policeman came calling while doing research on a book about 19 Squadron. Had it not been for historians like Dilip Sarkar and others like him, the stories of pilots such as George Unwin, Geoffrey Wellham and Bob Doe, to name but a few of the few, would have been lost. So, in his own words, this is how George Grumpy Unwin remembers getting the name.
Oh, didn't you know I'm known as Grumpy? And that was due to the fact that he, on one of these visits to the East Coast when we used to patrol the convoys, I went up there with him, and I said, now this time, if the balloon goes up, you can lead, and I'll fly as your number 2. This was the first time he was going to lead. And he went, we did this, and he forgot to put his, we were whistled off the ground on what is now Horsham St Faith, Norwich Airport. They were building it then, and we had a small piece of grass to take off from, very short, but enough. And off we went, and he forgot to put his aircraft into fine pitch for takeoff, and never got airborne, and crashed. As a result, he needed 2 tin legs. He wasn't hurt, the aircraft was a write-off. He wasn't hurt except for both his legs were ruined. And we got a new pair, but of course they're not machine-made, so they had to be adjusted. And we used to arrive at this place, we had a little bungalow, that's all we had, at 3:30 in the morning. Well, the first thing you want to do is put your head down and get some sleep. And I was trying to do this one there, and he's trying to adjust his legs with a file and a tin of oil. And the thing was going scrape, 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 scrape. Then he'd strap it on, and they go squeak, squeak, squeak as he walked around. And you can imagine, after hearing the scrape, you're then waiting for the squeak. And eventually I said, for God's sake, if you must do that, go outside and do it. And the 7 dwarfs were on locally. And they said, oh, shut up, Grumpy. And from then on, that was it. But he was a wonderful leader. He really was.
Having heard the story from the horse's mouth, surely this is the definitive answer to how George became grumpy for 41 years of service in the RAF. However, when you look at the evidence, this explanation really doesn't hold that much water. So does that mean that Brian Lane got it right to begin with? If you draw up a basic timeline of events, then you see that Brian's explanation for the nickname must have occurred on the morning of the 26th of May 1940. George claims that the naming was down to a crash Barder had at Horsham St Faith, which is recorded by the historian Michael G. Burns as having taken place on the 31st of March 1940. Based on this, the filing and squeaking that led to one of the best nicknames for a member of the few probably happened around the 2nd or 8th of April. Nevertheless, the story that George Unwin recounted to Conrad Wood, the interviewer for the Imperial War Museum, on the 25th of September 1990, doesn't make sense. For one thing, Barder and Unwin only flew together in a section on 2 occasions. The only time Barder led Unwin as a section commander was on the 16th of March 1940. On the day of the crash, when the self-professed superior pilot Barder forgot to select fine pitch for takeoff, Unwin wasn't even flying. Another misremembered aspect of his story is when he said Barder was with 19 Squadron over Dunkirk, and only then moved to Treble 2 Squadron as a flight commander. This is untrue. Barder left 19 Squadron on the 16th of April 1940, a full month before the balloon went up over Dunkirk. However, he would still have been stationed at Duxford with Treble 2 Squadron. This is by no means me calling Unwin a liar, rather it just highlights the realities that memories fade and play tricks on any individual. The key memory is that Barder was incredibly inconsiderate with his leg maintenance, and no doubt, given the man's huge personality, led to a witty comeback after being reprimanded by a lowly flight sergeant. Initially, I had thought that Brian Lane wasn't present at Horsham St Faith when the remark was made. On closer analysis, on the only 2 days Barder and Unwin were on early readiness at the forward base, the 2nd and 8th of April, Lane was also flying. The obvious conclusion is that he had not been kept up by the noise and didn't register the comical retort made by Barder. No doubt the name Grumpy was muttered a few other times over the following 2 months whenever Flight Sergeant Unwin made any complaint, coming to a head in front of the entire squadron gathered on the tarmac at Hornchurch during Operation Dynamo. Whatever the circumstances, we mustn't think that George Unwin was some cantankerous, antisocial NCO. Rather, he was a bloke with a great sense of humour and an even better eye for shooting. If you've enjoyed this video, please give it a like to help it spread to more people, and if you want to support the channel, the best thing to do is leave me a comment telling me what you think about the video and watching the next video on screen for you right now. It's a good one.